Hey everybody, we're the Super Monkey Fighters, back for more What Would You Change movie podcast. I'm of course Loki, here with Papa Nugget and Monkey Feathers. So how you guys doing?
Yeah.
Awesome. So awesome.
Into Interstellar. The blurb on IMDb is fantastic as usual. In a team of explorers travel through a wormhole in space in an attempt to ensure humanity's survival. If you don't know, it was directed by Christopher Nolan, written by Jonathan Nolan and Christopher Nolan. It stars Matthew McConaughey, Mackenzie Foy, John Lithgow, Timothy Chalamet. Bill Irwin does the voice of the robot Tars. Anne Hathaway is the Dr. Brand.
The younger Dr. Brand.
The younger of the Dr. Brand. Wes Bentley is Dr. Boyle. William Devane, Michael Caine, or My Cocaine is in that. Josh Stewart is the voice of Case. Casey Affleck plays an older version of Timothy Chalamet's character Tom. Jessica Chastain is Murph. Sorry, the credits are kind of all over the place. They did it kind of based on how they showed up on screen, even though they're calling it first build. So Topher Grace shows up in it, which is unfortunate for him. Is most of his roles are either completely forgettable or memorable for the wrong reasons. So outside of that 70s show. And then we'll wrap up the very eclectic cast with Matt Damon stuck on another planet needing to be rescued. Only this one he's a bit more of a dick than he was in The Martian. Anyway, likes. Monkey Feathers.
So one of the things that I did like about this was the opening where it had the older generation talking about what it was like during the flight.
Almost documentary.
Yeah,
style.
It was almost documentary, but then throughout, a little later on, a couple of scenes, it also still incorporated it. It did feel very documentary-like, where it wasn't quite a documentary, but it still had the elements of, well, during my day, and it was like this, and we had to flip the plates upside down so that they wouldn't be covered in dust. And I thought that was a really cool thing that they had added.
It's an interesting tool for exposition, right? You've got to explain a bunch of information, and you don't want to waste the time because you're already going to make a 4.5 hour movie. But you don't want to waste the time to show all of that, so you just kind of truncate it with like historic footage kind of a thing. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it was interesting because at the end of the film, you realize that it was more of it was more realistic of a documentary film because they were playing it throughout to describe to essentially the younger generation of what it was like and why these people are leaving Earth.
It has some context beyond just being there to jump on that. So.
I did like a lot of the special effects and the science behind it because you have relative theory or
theory of relativity.
Theory of relativity.
It's very grounded in
space-time.
So.
Well, it's grounded in science, but I liked the time jump where they're spending an hour, 2 hours down in the atmosphere of this one planet, of course not on purpose, but they're spending time on this planet, and then they come back to the ship and they realize that 23 years have passed instead of what they wanted, which was a couple of hours maybe to have passed on Earth.
The time dilation is they did a lot to really fix that. So one thing I actually really loved with that. The relativity and how time is relative and things are relative. Visually, they show this off in the movie because they kind of affix the camera. They do a lot of like snorri cam or driving shots, or where the camera is affixed to an object or a person, and the background moves. And it's not just the space shots. Like it's one of the early shots with his truck.
Yeah.
So it's a little nod that just visually that, hey, we're going to be talking about relativity a lot, and everything we're doing is giving you a reference point that you are relative to this kind of a thing. And so just that stood out to me a lot this time.
So with the time jump and that it's a very heartbreaking scene, but it is essentially like he watched his kids grow up in front of him and he has no way of talking to them throughout that time of them growing up. And it's really heartbreaking, which helped lend to these characters who just want to go home. They just want to see their families again. So I liked the time jump. I liked a lot of the special effects with space. And I liked, to an extent, the sound effects, because with the space aspect where you have no sound in space, so basically it's quiet, but it's not just quiet. There's music to help enhance it, but you're not hearing the sound in space because there's no sound in space, except of course when they're in an enclosed area with oxygen to help create sound. But to an extent, I did like the special effects. I did like the sound effects.
I mean, all the way through, I thought all of the environments were done really well. Ships, I appreciate that there was some thought put into the ship design. They tried to be unique with it.
Well, it seemed like logical progression from where we're at today. Like it wasn't leaps and bounds above. Somebody took a scientific theory and then made a really fancy looking spaceship.
Yeah,
kind of a thing. It's these all feel very much like steps up from where we're at. So it's still grounded a little bit in reality that way.
Yeah, and I think that's right. They do seem like improvements to where we're at, but not to the point where there are large atriums in a spaceship in which you can freely walk around. And yeah, it's a little
completely
more
unnecessary,
grounded in reality, which I appreciate. And the all the other environments, the other planets, the space shots, like I thought it was all done really well. It was eye candy to look at, which for a space movie is always a good thing. Because it's pretty bad
special effects.
if you get it wrong, and it's terrible.
It's one of the interesting things having watched recently watching through like old Star Trek or like the Next Generation era, where you're like, wow, you're on a planet again, and it's just a bunch of styrofoam rocks on a soundstage, and it really looks like that.
Don't tell anyone. They need to believe in the magic.
And these days it's technology's jumped to the point where you're like, if you were to do that, that would be an obvious joke rather than like you would have to put more effort into making it look that bad these days, I think. So
yeah. I enjoyed the TARS character, the robot.
Yeah, the robot TARS.
Yeah.
It was
those ones are strange ones because they take a lot of, they were just voice actors, right? But in the world, they took time to program realistic human voices for them, but they're just giant rectangles with a screen on them.
Well, realistic voices, but also putting in the effort
and
putting the effort of personalities of what's your truth percentage, what's your humor percentage,
90%.
things like that.
Yeah.
90%.
Yes.
But I also really like that too, where it's not just the sci-fi trope where there's a random human person standing there that's a robot. Oh, you're the synthetic human, the aliens, kind of a thing. Like that worked for Aliens. Let's move on and do our own things. So
So I enjoyed that it was different, and the way that they integrated it. It felt like it fit into the story without being distracting, but still provided the comic relief that it was intending to deliver. So I thought that was done really well.
Yeah, I really like that, the camaraderie between them, where it's not just he's the slapstick robot to throw out quips and jabs here and there. It's like he is a functional participant in this journey, where when he needs to be serious, he's serious. When he jokes, he jokes. And then when he's pushed to give up private information, he points out that he does have discretionary settings, and he's not.
Well, and even at the end of the movie, where they're basically saying that they're going to sacrifice the robot. Anne Hathaway's character, Dr. Brand, says,
Yeah.
we can't force him to do that. And then Matthew McConaughey's character says, we don't have to force him to do anything. He's a robot.
Yeah.
And then her response was, you're a dick. So they grew very attached for, I guess, good reason, but they grew very attached to these robots because they were essentially another crewmate.
Mm-hmm. I thought Matthew McConaughey did a good job. He was a believable character. And I think he did a good job in portraying kind of that. He seemed very torn between his decisions with leaving and his decisions to leave and what that means to his relationship with him and his family. I thought that was all acted very well. At least you felt like it was real, which I think is central to the whole part of the show.
Yeah, I do like that most of his decisions kind of are made based on a lie. Like he makes those decisions fully believing that the plan is to save his kids. So he's acting out of motivation for that.
Save his kids and save the rest of humanity that's on Earth, essentially.
But if it were just you need to save humanity, he wouldn't have gone along with it. He would have stayed with his kids because he makes he's very rooted in that protective parent role. Most of his dialogue is that, one of the things that when he is explaining to Dr. Brand about why he didn't tell his daughter about how dire the situation was, is because as a parent, you don't tell a 10-year-old that, the world's coming ending to an end. That's just not a thing you do. That's part of the protection that you have as a parent. So, but where the goal of the mission was never to try and do that, it was always to try and just seed human life somewhere else. He wouldn't have made those decisions because he makes some really tough decisions. And even he gets the chance to look back at his decisions and try and tell himself not to make them. But I think that hinges all on the lie. And I think it's very believable the entire time when he's making those decisions because he thinks he's going to save his family and save his kids. And when he finds out that it's not the case, he's like, okay, nope, I made mistakes. I need to get back to them. And I got to figure out ways of traveling back in time so that I can see them again, those kinds of things. So yeah, the acting is one of the things that I loved in this. And some of the decisions for filmmakers where there are scenes we've brought up when I think it's when they come back from the planet and it's been 20 years in Earth time, rather than show what's on the screen with the video, they stay on Matthew McConaughey and stay on his reaction. It's one of those decisions that is, I think it's the smarter one because we need to be, the journey that we're on is with Matthew McConaughey. We need to be there with him while he's going through those emotions and not seeing what his family was doing. But we still need to see the family. And so just the way that scene is structured is this starts out with this just kind of heartbreaking, gut-wrenching. He's missed his grandson being born and dying and the hardships that his family's going through. And his daughter hasn't left him a message until the very end.
Well, the very end on her birthday.
On her birthday, when she's as old as he was.
Same age. Yeah.
So it goes from this kind of mixed bag emotions, where it's happy and sad mixed together and all of the things that he's missed, and then it just kind of that final nail in the coffin for her kind of a thing. Like it's just I think that's a brilliant scene, and I think it's been memed a lot. It's been kind of a joke since it came out with Matthew McConaughey crying, but it still gets me watching it. I still connect with it, even knowing what it's about, what's coming. So, but I remember seeing that the first time and being really impacted by that kind of stuff. And as we've said on pretty much every episode of this, if it's a character-driven story and you believe in the characters, it's gonna be a good movie. And I think this pulls that off really well. I'm
definitely more connected to Matthew McConaughey in this movie than Matt Damon in The Martian.
In The Martian. The question is, are you more connected to Matt Damon in this movie than he was in The Martian?
Maybe. I don't know.
That was one thing that I actually, having watched them both almost back to back at this point, the whole scene where he's effectively he's killing Coop by leaving him there after explaining everything that's going on. As he's walking away, just that continual cowardice that keeps coming up in him, where he's trying to justify everything that he's doing. And then he's trying to say that I thought I could watch you die, but I'm not strong enough. And so then he's walking away and listening to him and still trying to talk to him while you hear him choke. And then there's a point where he just has to turn his communicator off because, you know, he doesn't have the strength to do what's there. And it's that survival instinct just isn't there. And I think this time through, it was really enhanced by having watched The Martian beforehand, where it was that everything's going to work out. And this was the Murphy's Law, which is a big theme in this film, in the bad, where he's going to do everything that's bad because that's kind of more in his nature at this point in time. And it's one of the things I absolutely love too, is kind of the death of his character, where he's ignoring all of them and ignoring all of the warnings as he's attaching to the ship, and he's not sealed correctly. And he's going to give another big emblazoned speech like he's been doing the entire time, and then just out the window, away he goes. I just, that's fantastic, where he's just completely oblivious, to everything going on, and, is too stuck in his own ego. So.
In that scene for that explosion of him getting sucked out, it goes back to what I really liked about the sound effects, is because you hear the explosion for a split second, but then all of the sound disappears because there's now no air to interact to create sound.
Yeah.
So that was something that I found really interesting, because it just happens so quick and then it's gone. And then the sound's gone, and they're from their own perspective of the ship that's flying back to the main ship that they're watching as it's happening. So that was just a little side thing to throw in there that, it throws in the fact that, the sound effects and what they did was good.
Yeah, no, the sound design, like I think you said, it's a mixed bag. I'm going to put it in both columns, in good and bad, because they do a lot of things really right. They do some things for effect. Dislikes. I think we should just get right off the bat, the audio, the sound design. So I will put music. I was in the positive category of this. I actually absolutely loved this, and I'm sure Monkey Feathers will get into much more detail about this. The thing that bugged me.
I'll agree. I'll agree that the music was good. So we'll throw that back into the positive
music
category.
is good, but the sound design, where they tried to be more realistic with it, made it very difficult to understand what was going on. And I agree with that stylistic choice. The thing I don't agree with is the fact that I was constantly on the volume watching this. I was going up and down and up and down, not in scenes where that would make sense, where a character's in a spacesuit, or they're in space, or it's difficult to hear. He was sitting in the farmhouse with his daughter, or in their house with his daughter, just talking to her, and it's like, okay, well, I've got to, normally my audio sits around 19. I've got to go to 45 to hear what they're saying. And then 2 seconds later, I got to drop it back down to the entire time it was just up and down. And so the scenes where it doesn't make sense in the story, that's where it's bad. The scenes where it fits for the story, where it's over a radio, or there's something else going on, there's not oxygen in the room, that I absolutely love. But just regular dialogue being up and down.
Was it because Matthew McConaughey seemed like he was whispering most of the time?
Then that's the thing, is I think there are times where they were whispering, and then there are times where they were talking, and you're like, they're whispering, but I shouldn't have to strain to hear that. You're going to have this entire scene with a father and daughter, this very gripping emotional scene that I can't understand. So that's my big gripe with the sound design. Outside of that,
I'm actually surprised that you have thrown that into a big gripe, because I remember probably a year or two ago when we were talking about Interstellar, and a year or two ago I was not in the mood to watch Interstellar. The idea that this movie has reached so many people and has gotten so much flack for the sound, I didn't really want to watch it for that. But in having seen it, there are some things that I like about it. But the biggest thing that I have issues with is the sound, because it's a director's choice. It comes from Christopher Nolan. And he specifically has written that he wanted it to be realistic for scenes. He wanted it to fit with the environment and things like that. But in doing so, theaters, as they were presenting this to the audience, had to specifically make signs or disclaimers saying it's the movie, it's not their sound system, so we can't do anything about it.
Well,
Some
and-
theaters had to actually bump up the middle speaker, the center speaker, which is where the main dialogue comes through. They had to bump that up as high as they could just for this movie so that people could
and that's the thing,
potentially hear what was going on.
hearing the explanation, I was like, no, I agree 100% that if a character's in a spacesuit in a loud environment, that it should be difficult to hear what they're saying, and that lends to the story. But again, in a quiet room with people just talking, you shouldn't have to have that, you know. And then it's followed up by a really loud musical note that you're just like,
Yeah.
you just made me bump my, double my volume, and now I'm deaf because, yeah. So
Because of the music that cut in. Yeah, you talked about having to be on the volume the whole time for this. That was how I felt. Because I'm sitting there straining to hear just dialogue. Or it's incoherent dialogue. There's the scene with Michael Caine, who he's dying in the hospital. He's talking to the younger Cooper, Jessica Chastain's character, and there are things that he's saying, but I can't understand what he's saying. So I'm having to rely on her
not a finger
the whole time, not a finger. But I'm having to rely on what she's saying. But even then, I feel like I'm missing half the conversation because I can't understand what he's saying.
Yeah, I rewatched that scene like 4 times and I still don't even understand what he said.
Right? and I get that he's dying and he's old and he's probably senile at this point. But it still makes it difficult because you're missing half the conversation, so you're missing half of the information that you're supposed to be getting.
Well, it's frustrating because it takes you out, because instead of focusing on the scene and what's going on, you're focusing on trying to understand what somebody's saying. And so it's
that was one of the biggest things that I had issues with, because you should not have to worry about bumping the audio up or going deaf because the audio's up and something else, big explosion happens and now you're deaf or whatever.
Like I said, it's kind of that double-edged sword where it is when it's good in this film, it's amazing in this film.
Yeah.
And then when it should be like serviceable, it's just bad. Like, anyway, moving on from that, anything else glaring that stood out to anybody?
Yeah. Matt Damon's character. I felt that it was unnecessary to create a villain in this. I get that he faked his results and his positive readings to be saved, but when people come to rescue him, be flat out and say, look, I just wanted to be rescued. This planet's uninhabitable. Don't waste time. Figure out the planet and try and find a serviceable area for people to start habiting. It was unnecessary. And I think a waste of time for an already almost 3-hour movie.
It's funny because I think there's some interesting things with how they kind of swap some characters back and forth, right? There's kind of the mission commander who dies on the ocean planet. I think that kind of role is kind of filled by Matt Damon's after the fact. I actually do really like his character in this. I think it does add to that survival element of individual versus society or as a species.
Kind of brings to light or exemplifies the selfishness of, I think, humanity as a whole, but it's personified in his character.
Yeah, and with his character beforehand, the only thing anybody ever says about his character before that is he's the best of us. He's the best of us. He's the best of us. If he's the best of us, as in the best of humanity has to offer, he's far more realistic in what humanity would be. In that humans, because of their selfish nature and because of their need for self-preservation, it's going to be very difficult for us to survive because of that, because we can't see past our own selves. And so I really like the character. That
the scene with Dr. Brandon Cooper, where they said, well, why didn't they tell us the truth? And well, what about all the scientists who are building for Plan A? He said, well, because no one would work on it, because humanity is out for themselves. And I get that, but it's still an unnecessary villain for a science movie, because it just kind of seemed like a side story instead of the main story. And the way that it was incorporated, I felt it very unnecessary.
Yeah, and I see him more as he's the personification of humanity. He's kind of the antithesis of the hope that Cooper brings to it. And that's why Michael Caine tries to get him involved, is because he knows that there's that element of the unknown, which is actually my kind of gripe to the film, is that whole love will carry us through. Like the missing element that we needed to solve all of these problems is that it was this love and this connection. But that's where I think it's more of he's the personification of the anti-science movement sort of a thing, where it's the greed and it's those kinds of things. And so to see him just as a villain, he doesn't work, but to see him as a personification of humanity, I think does really well. Plus, I think this time watching through it all, I was taken a lot more by just the acting, like the change in characters for similar films and similar those kinds of things. So
I won't knock the acting, because the acting was great. I won't knock the character and the fact that he's making these decisions for survival. But in the grand scheme of the movie, I just felt it very unnecessary to have him in and to have him then turn out to be a villain, and he's going to essentially kill people and things like that. Personification of humanity or not, I just felt it very unnecessary.
Nugget, anything you didn't particularly like?
It was too long.
I agree that there's a lot they could have. This one feels a lot tighter and flows better than like The Martian, but
I'd agree. The movie kept your attention better than The Martian. That's for sure. It feels kind of slow at times, and I think some it could just be cleaned up a little bit to reduce some of that time without too much being lost as a consequence.
I mean, thinking through it, it does seem like he gets to space really quick, and it seems like there's some decisions that they made. He finds NASA. They convince him to go on the mission. There's the scene with him and leaving his family. And then there's not any build up to him going into space. Like they start the countdown as he's driving away. So you can hear that as he's driving away. Mm-hmm. And you can see the emotion of what he's going through as he's driving away, and his family and all that kind of stuff. And then it's just, oh, we're in space and away we go. So I think they did some of those kinds of things well. I think if they just, maybe did a little bit more of that with some of them. I honestly think the water planet is where I would have cut it out, I think, as we maybe transition a little bit more into what we would change. But if I were to cut something out, I think that's where I would have cut it, because I think that's the least necessary part of the story.
Yeah, it's almost like they used that part just as a time to kind of introduce this whole space-time thing.
Yeah, the time dilation, and to randomly get rid of a character who's had maybe 4 lines the entire film. It just seems weird. And then it sets up, I think the more important part of that entire sequence is just after it, when they're deciding on where they need to go because they don't have enough fuel to go to the 2 other places. As cool of a scene and sequence as it is on the water planet, especially where it's like, a few feet of water, a foot of water, less than that. Like, I think it's ankle deep-ish, maybe knee deep. And they talk about the different gravity and how that's affecting them, and which is probably a more difficult part to hear in the film, where they talk about it's like 1.8 times Earth's gravity. Yeah. And so when Dr. Brand goes out to find the data, and she kind of trips a little bit, and the spacecraft rolls on her a little bit, like there's no possible way that she can lift that off of her because it's the gravity. And that's why Case, the other robot, has to go out and save her. I do like all those kinds of things, but I think that feels more like action sequence for action sequence. Like, oh, we don't want the middle to be boring, so we need a giant wave to come in and loud noises and that kind of stuff. So I think that's the biggest thing I would change.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about length of movie, we already know that I would, trim down the Matt Damon scene. But the other thing that I know is kind of a stickler for me, and I would make it more logical, is the whole Plan A option of you're sitting here building essentially a spaceship, and you're sending people into space to find planets. But the time frame doesn't seem like it would fit, because you're relying on the fact that you can find a planet that's habitable, and then 23 years have passed in the time that they were on the one planet. Mm-hmm. Well, in the beginning of the movie, Michael Caine's character, he said that Murph's generation will be the last to live on Earth. So that gives you probably 100 years, maybe. You don't have much time.
Yeah.
You don't have much time to fix the problem. And
Well, but
with everything that can go wrong in this,
yeah,
it's based on Murphy's Law that this whole movie kind of revolves around. So anything that can go wrong, or anything that could go...
Can happen, will happen.
Yeah, anything that can happen will happen. And so you're putting so much faith into an idea that it just didn't seem logical for the time frame. And I get that their main, Michael Caine's character, Professor Brand, his main goal was to have Plan B go through, but you're sitting here wasting time. You're wasting time you don't have.
They talk about how the anomaly showed up around Saturn 50 years before. It's like 53 years before, something like that. And then it was 10 years before that they had sent the Lazarus team through. So they kind of gloss over it a little bit, but he does talk about the fact that like resources, like they don't have the resources. If they did, it would have been a lot different. But it's hard to get public opinion on your side when people can't put food on the table. So
yeah, and I understand that, but at least for plot, story, writing, everything like that, change the time frame, and I'll believe your story, because it just, with everything that was going on, basically by the time he went through the black hole and the anomaly and everything like that, I would have just thought, oh man, everyone's dead on Earth. No one's left to survive. Him and Dr. Brand are the only ones left. They're now the Adam and Eve, and they'll repopulate a new planet.
Because by the time he goes through the black hole, because they slingshot around the black hole, and they say that would add 53 years to their, so they're already 70 something years in the future at that point in time. So yeah, it was.
Yeah, that's the problem that I would change, because change the time frame, and then you make mistakes, but you still have time to save humanity.
Like, I think overall I enjoyed it. And there's not a lot I would change. But at the same time, I still feel a little unsettled about that conclusion. I can't put my finger on it. So, yeah, I don't have anything else, really.
Would you cut Matt Damon out of the film entirely?
No. I would not.
I wouldn't say entirely, but I would shorten it. Make it more, hey, look, this planet's uninhabitable. I faked the numbers. I wanted you to rescue me. Great, let's move on and let's find a different solution.
Well, or they show up and they try to defrost him out of the... So that's one thing I would change. The cryo sleep thing to me was just really creepy and weird. Like, I didn't like any of that. Like, that was, it's like, no, I'll die in space. You guys, good luck. I'll see you on the other side. I don't want to get into a Ziploc bag in a water-filled crypt that gets filed away in a filing cabinet. But I think that would be a way that you could have changed that, is you have them open that up and it's a dead Matt Damon. And then they learn that it was all a lie, and that but I still think that for the film standpoint, because they kind of went to the because that doesn't work keeping in the water planet, because that's effectively what happens at the water planet. They show up there and they're like, oh, she probably died a few minutes ago because of the time dilation. So to just kind of do that again, I don't think that would have worked as well. So I think it's either, it's one or the other, I think, in my mind, as far as a change goes. So, and I don't disagree that maybe changing that up, generic
his character
dude who dies, like, he could have filled that same role of revealing that, yes, it was never about bringing Earth, people from Earth out here. It was always about reseeding.
Or the robot, because the robot has the discretion filter percentage that maybe the time came that he needed to reveal that information. Yeah. So there were other ways to reveal it, other ways to go about it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those things I've never really thought too much about it in that aspect. I do kind of like that. So one argument I did have at the time with another friend, I really liked the aspect of the film where they'd make the connection to the film always talks about they and them, who made this anomaly show up. Like, this is not a naturally occurring thing. Somebody placed this here, and who are they? I liked that was humans from the future is kind of what they make it out to be. That's, he says, like, no, this is us giving ourselves, like, we've transcended four dimensions
saving
and
ourselves.
we're saving ourselves. And I felt like that was nice because it wasn't Deus Ex Machina. It wasn't just by the way, this unforeseen God. That's what Deus Ex Machina was in Greeks. Is it just came down to, we need to end this story, so Zeus shows up and solves the problems or whatever it is. I felt at the time it wasn't that at all, and I had a friend who felt that it very much was that, and so we argued at length about that. So I would pose that as a question to both you as well as the audience. Do you feel like future humans in this is kind of a cop-out Deus Ex Machina ending, or is it a better way of telling the story where it's not aliens or angels or whatever kind of a thing?
I think it's a mixed bag because it's the idea of time travel where the only way that it can happen is if you survive it. And so if the wormhole wasn't there, then humanity doesn't survive. But in the first iteration of this, how is the wormhole there if humanity didn't survive? It's the idea of the egg versus the chicken.
Yeah.
Where how is it in place if the first iteration of humanity wasn't able to go and survive and then send the wormhole back?
Well, and it's a difficult thing for me to understand. I think for anybody to understand, because it is the dimensional hop. Because when they're explaining the wormhole and how it works with the cliched, I'm going to draw a line on a piece of paper and then fold it in half, and that's what we're doing. But the important part of that's different from how other people have done that is when he pokes the hole, and Cooper's asking why the wormhole is a sphere, and he's like, well, I'm explaining to you a three-dimensional concept in two dimensions, and in two dimensions, it's a circle is the portal. And so what's a circle in three dimensions? It's a sphere.
Yeah.
And that's what you're trying to understand that we can't understand because we live in, four dimensions, time being one of them. You can't understand what time would be like in a higher dimension because you're not living in it. We're effectively a two-dimensional being trying to comprehend a third dimension. We can't do it. And so, it's also one of those things that is, scientifically accurate in the film that I do really like. And so it's a tough one because it is like, if time were a physical dimension that you could, like a book, you could open it up and see where anything and everything was. It makes perfect sense that you could put a wormhole wherever you needed to put a wormhole. But it doesn't make sense to us because it just seems kind of trite and cliche that, you can't, if you need to do these things in order to make this happen, that doesn't work because it doesn't work. But in the same way that a sphere doesn't work in two dimensions. Yeah, anyway, before we ramble on for much longer, I think we should wrap it up there. I don't know, maybe we'll some of these bigger, longer, deeper films, maybe we'll revisit them in a while, but probably not. I don't know. Anyway, let us know in the comments down below what you guys thought of Interstellar, what you thought of our review, and our thoughts. Do you agree or disagree with anything that we've said? Leave those comments down below, and we'll sign off and catch you guys in the next one. Adios.
Yeah.